A once-feared assassin retreats to a quiet village to escape his violent past, only to be humiliated and broken by a ruthless gang, until he decides to fight back. But as he confronts his enemies, the shadows of his past resurface, leading to a final showdown where a single stranger's arrival changes everything. What secret does this mysterious figure hold? Alejandro had always cherished the serenity of his small village. Each morning he followed a comforting routine: a cup of strong coffee, a slow stroll in his wheelchair through the market, and the warm greetings of neighbors who, though polite, often kept their distance. He had made peace with this life of quiet anonymity, or so he thought. That morning, the air buzzed with life as vendors shouted over each other, promoting their goods. Alejandro rolled through the cobblestone streets, the uneven terrain a challenge he had long since mastered. The sun shone warmly, promising a peaceful day. The illusion shattered when he heard the familiar, mocking laughter of Ramon. The local thug and self-proclaimed leader of a small gang, Ramon had made it his mission to torment anyone who seemed weak, and Alejandro had been a favorite target for years. "Alejandro!" Ramon's voice cut through the noise. The crowd fell silent, their unease palpable. Alejandro froze, his hands tightening on the wheels of his chair as the gang approached. Ramon's cruel grin was a harbinger of trouble. "Well, look who's here. The hero of the market," Ramon sneered. His gang roared with laughter. Before Alejandro could react, one of them kicked the side of his wheelchair, sending it wobbling precariously. "Leave me alone," Alejandro said firmly, though his voice trembled. The gang only laughed harder. In a flash, Ramon grabbed Alejandro's chair and tipped it over, spilling him onto the hard cobblestones. Gasps rippled through the onlookers, but no one stepped forward. The gang hooted and cheered as they smashed the contents of Alejandro's bag: a loaf of bread, a small notebook, and a photo of a young woman, onto the ground. The photo caught Ramon's eye. "Who's this?" he jeered, holding it up. Alejandro clawed toward him, ignoring the pain shooting through his arms. Ramon only held the photo higher, examining it with mock curiosity before tearing it in half. "Guess it doesn't matter." Alejandro's heart pounded with a mix of humiliation and rage, but he said nothing. He knew better than to give Ramon more ammunition. Finally, bored with their game, the gang sauntered off, leaving Alejandro sprawled in the dirt. The crowd slowly dispersed, some murmuring apologies, others pretending not to see. A kind woman eventually helped Alejandro back into his chair, but her hands shook as she did so. "Thank you," he muttered, barely meeting her eyes. His pride was in tatters, his spirit bruised. When Alejandro finally returned home, the small wooden house that had once been a refuge now felt like a prison. His hands trembled as he cleaned his scraped palms, the dull ache in his body overshadowed by the storm in his mind. Memories he had buried deep began to claw their way to the surface, faces, voices, and blood. Always blood. He wheeled himself to the corner of his living room, where an old trunk lay covered in dust. His hand hovered over it before he pulled away, shaking his head. Not yet. He wasn't ready to face that part of himself again. But as the sun set, Alejandro realized something had shifted. His peaceful routine was shattered, and Ramon had crossed a line. Whether he wanted to or not, Alejandro knew this was only the beginning. For the first time in years, the anger within him stirred, a dormant fire flickering to life. The night wrapped itself around Alejandro's small home, a suffocating blanket of silence broken only by the rhythmic creak of his wheelchair. He sat by the window, staring into the darkness beyond, but his mind was trapped in a far darker void: his past. Years ago, Alejandro had been a shadow in the underworld, a figure feared and whispered about in equal measure. His hands, once steady and precise, had held the power to end lives with chilling efficiency. A ghost of that confidence lingered within him, but it was buried beneath years of guilt and the consequences of a single, catastrophic moment. The accident had been his undoing, a job gone wrong, a misstep, a moment of arrogance, and everything had changed. The explosion had torn through his body, leaving him alive but forever altered. Paraplegia had not only robbed him of his mobility, but had also become a constant reminder of his former life. He had sworn to leave it all behind, retreating to the isolated village to build something resembling a new life. Yet now, the quiet he had worked so hard to maintain seemed fragile. Ramon's sneering face haunted him, and the weight of humiliation burned hot in his chest. His mind played the scene on an endless loop: the laughter, the photo torn in two, the jeering crowd. Each replay sharpened the anger smoldering within him. Alejandro wheeled himself toward the trunk in the corner of his living room. His hand hovered over the latch again, just as it had earlier. This time, he opened it. The contents were a stark contrast to his humble surroundings. A sleek pistol, its surface polished to a mirror shine, lay atop a collection of tools of his trade. Knives, surveillance equipment, and a weathered notebook filled with names and details. Beneath it all, tucked carefully into the corner, was a photograph. The same one Ramon had destroyed, but whole. Alejandro traced the outline of the smiling woman in the picture, his jaw tightening. She had been the only person who had seen the humanity behind his monstrous facade. Her loss had driven him into the arms of violence, a spiral he thought he'd escaped. But now, as he held the photo, he felt the pull of that old self. The anger Ramon had ignited wasn't just about the humiliation or the pain. It was the awakening of something Alejandro had buried, but never truly let go of. Outside, the village lay quiet, but Alejandro knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Ramon's arrogance would lead him back, and Alejandro had no illusions that the man would stop with petty humiliations. He was testing the limits, and soon, the stakes would rise. Alejandro placed the photo back in the trunk and closed it, the soft click echoing in the still room. For now, he wasn't ready to take action, but a decision loomed on the horizon. The man he had been and the man he wanted to be were at odds, and the balance was tipping. The morning light crept through Alejandro's window, highlighting the disarray of his small home. His wheelchair sat at the foot of his bed, as lifeless as he felt. Alejandro had barely slept. Memories of his past mingled with Ramon's taunts, a cacophony that refused to let him rest. A knock at the door startled him. It was firm, yet not aggressive, a gesture of someone who cared but was hesitant to intrude. Alejandro rolled toward the door and opened it to find Maria standing there, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. Her face, usually bright with warmth, was shadowed with concern. "I heard what happened," she said softly, stepping inside before he could respond. Without asking, she placed the basket on the table and began tidying up his scattered belongings. "Why didn't you tell me?" Alejandro remained silent, unsure of how to answer. He had always admired Maria's strength. She had a way of commanding a room without raising her voice. Her presence alone was often enough to calm him, but not today. "You can't let them do this to you," she said, turning to face him. "It's not just about you, Alejandro. Ramon and his gang have been tormenting the whole village. They're getting bolder. And what do you suggest I do?" Alejandro's voice was sharp, laced with frustration. "You've seen them. You know what they're capable of." Maria's expression hardened. "I know they thrive on fear, and I know that if we don't stand up to them, they'll keep taking more. First, it's you. Next, it's someone else." Alejandro looked away, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. He wanted to believe in her words, but his own doubts held him back. He had been a force to be reckoned with once, but now he was just a man in a wheelchair, burdened by a past he couldn't escape. "I've already spoken to some of the neighbors," Maria continued, her tone softening. "They're scared, but they'll listen if someone leads them. If you spoke up—" "No," Alejandro interrupted, his voice firm. "This isn't their fight. Ramon won't stop because a few villagers tell him to. You'll just paint a target on your back." Maria stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "And what about you? Are you just going to let him win? Let him decide how the rest of us live?" Her words struck a chord, but Alejandro couldn't bring himself to answer. She sighed and placed a hand on his shoulder. "I won't push you, Alejandro, but think about it. You're stronger than you realize." As she left, Alejandro remained by the window, watching her disappear down the road. Her courage was undeniable, but it also terrified him. Maria was right. Ramon's reign of terror wouldn't end on its own. Yet the thought of confronting it alone, or dragging others into harm's way, filled him with dread. The village's quiet seemed more fragile than ever, and Alejandro knew it wouldn't last. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. Alejandro sat in his living room, staring at the wooden trunk in the corner. It loomed large in the dim light, a relic of a life he had tried to bury but couldn't forget. Maria's visit had left him unsettled, her words echoing in his mind. "You're stronger than you realize." With a deep breath, Alejandro wheeled himself to the trunk and unlatched it. The lid creaked open, revealing its contents. a compact arsenal of weapons and tools meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. Each item was a piece of his former self, the ghost of a man who had once thrived in chaos and violence. His eyes fell on a faded envelope tucked into a corner. He picked it up with a shaking hand, pulling out a photograph. The image was worn but clear enough to reveal the faces of three men standing shoulder to shoulder, their expressions grim but determined. Alejandro was among them, younger, stronger, and unrecognizable compared to the man he had become. Beneath the photograph was a folded sheet of paper, yellowed with age. He unfolded it slowly, reading the scrawled words, "Never forget why you fight." The phrase struck him like a punch to the gut. He had long since abandoned the reasons he once justified his actions with. All that remained was the wreckage of a life lived too recklessly. The faint sound of laughter outside snapped him back to the present. Alejandro wheeled to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the street below. Ramon and his gang sauntered past, their loud voices cutting through the village's uneasy calm. A young boy ran into their path, clutching a toy, only for one of Ramon's men to kick it from his hands. The boy's mother pulled him away, her face pale with fear, as the gang erupted in laughter. Alejandro's hands gripped the armrests of his chair tightly. The anger simmering inside him threatened to boil over. Ramon wasn't just targeting him, he was choking the spirit of the entire village. It was a tactic Alejandro recognized all too well: divide, intimidate, and conquer. It was the same playbook he had once followed, and it worked only as long as no one stood against it. He returned to the trunk, this time pulling out a sleek pistol. Its weight was familiar, comforting even. He checked the magazine with practiced ease, the muscle memory still intact after all these years. But as he stared at the weapon, a wave of hesitation washed over him. Alejandro placed the pistol back into the trunk and closed the lid. He wasn't ready, not yet, but he knew the time was coming when he would have to choose. Ramon's escalating terror was forcing his hand, and Alejandro could feel the old instincts stirring deep within him. The man he once was might be the only one capable of ending this nightmare, but was he willing to become that man again? The night descended heavily on the village, cloaking its cobbled streets and modest homes in a veil of stillness. But Alejandro was wide awake, the quiet amplifying the turmoil in his mind. Ramon's laughter, the boy's toy kicked aside, and Maria's resolute words all merged into a single driving force. For the first time in years, Alejandro felt a dangerous clarity. His hands moved with purpose, retrieving tools from the trunk. He worked in silence, his movements precise, as if the years of disuse had only sharpened his instincts. The pistol was cleaned and holstered, but he didn't plan to use it tonight. This wasn't about killing, it was about sending a message. By the time the clock struck midnight, Alejandro was ready. Dressed in dark clothing, he moved through the village's back alleys, his wheelchair gliding soundlessly over the uneven stones. He had spent months studying every corner of the village, learning its layout not out of necessity, but as a way to adapt to his limitations. Now that knowledge would serve a different purpose. Ramon's gang operated a small warehouse on the outskirts of the village, a hub for their illicit activities. Alejandro had seen them coming and going with crates, overheard whispered rumors of smuggling and theft. It was there that he would strike. The warehouse loomed in the moonlight, a dilapidated structure surrounded by a fence. Alejandro parked his wheelchair in the shadows and retrieved a pair of bolt cutters. His hands moved deftly, cutting through the chains securing the gate. The faint clink of metal hitting the ground was the only sound as he slipped inside. The air was thick with the scent of oil and damp wood. Alejandro navigated carefully, his sharp eyes scanning for movement. Ramon's men were careless. The lone guard stationed outside the building was leaning against a post, half asleep. Alejandro avoided him with ease, slipping into the shadows of the warehouse. Inside, rows of crates lined the walls, marked with cryptic symbols that hinted at their illegal contents. Alejandro moved quickly, placing small devices on several key crates, homemade incendiary charges he had crafted earlier that evening. They weren't designed to kill, only to destroy and make a statement. As he finished placing the charges, Alejandro noticed a set of papers lying on a desk near the back of the warehouse. Curious, he wheeled closer and scanned the documents. They detailed Ramon's operations, including names, supply routes, and even payments to corrupt officials. It was a treasure trove of information, the kind that could dismantle Ramon's empire if it fell into the right hands. Alejandro tucked the papers into his bag and exited as silently as he had entered. Once he was a safe distance away, he triggered the charges. The explosions lit up the night, flames consuming the warehouse in a blaze of destruction. Alejandro watched from the shadows, his heart pounding not with fear but with a grim satisfaction. The fire was a signal, one Ramon couldn't ignore. As villagers emerged from their homes, startled by the noise, Alejandro slipped away, his presence as anonymous as a ghost. By the time Ramon arrived at the scene, his face twisted in fury. The damage was done. The warehouse was lost, and with it, a vital piece of his control over the village. Scrawled on a piece of charred wood near the entrance was a single word: enough. Alejandro returned home as dawn broke, his body weary, but his mind alive with thoughts. The first step had been taken, but the battle was far from over. Ramon would retaliate, that much was certain. But for the first time, Alejandro felt the fire of his old self burning brightly, and he knew he couldn't stop now. The morning after the fire, the village buzzed with whispers. Smoke still lingered in the air, a reminder of the inferno that had consumed Ramon's warehouse. Most villagers avoided discussing it openly, fearful of drawing unwanted attention. But Alejandro could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. For the first time in years, there was hope, faint but present, hidden beneath layers of fear. Maria arrived at Alejandro's door just as the sun reached its peak. Her face was pale, her movements hurried. Without waiting for an invitation, she stepped inside and shut the door behind her. "Did you hear?" she asked, her voice low. Alejandro nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "I heard there was a fire." Maria's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb, Alejandro. I know you had something to do with it." Her words hung in the air. But Alejandro didn't respond. He simply stared at her, waiting. Maria sighed, her frustration giving way to worry. "Ramon is furious. He's going around town, questioning people. He knows someone's challenging him, and he won't stop until he finds out who." Alejandro's jaw tightened. "And what about the villagers? Are they talking?" "They're scared," Maria admitted. "But some are starting to believe he's not untouchable anymore. They don't know if it's worth the risk." Alejandro's silence was his answer, and Maria shook her head. "You can't fight this alone. Sooner or later, he'll come after you." Later that evening, Alejandro's worst fears came true. The sound of hurried footsteps and shouts outside his home jolted him from his seat. He wheeled toward the window and saw a small crowd gathered down the road. His heart sank when he spotted Maria among them, sitting on the ground, clutching her arm. He moved as fast as he could, ignoring the pain in his shoulders. When he reached the crowd, someone stepped aside to let him through. Maria's face was pale, her lip bloodied, and her blouse torn at the sleeve. "What happened?" Alejandro demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. Maria tried to wave him off, but another villager spoke up. "It was Ramon's men. They cornered her in the market." Alejandro's blood boiled as he looked at Maria. "Why didn't you tell me you were going out alone?" "I'm not going to cower in my home," she snapped, wincing as she adjusted her arm. "I won't let them control me." Her defiance both inspired and enraged him. Ramon's actions weren't just about revenge. They were calculated, a warning to anyone who might think about standing up to him. And Maria, whether she admitted it or not, was becoming a symbol of resistance. Alejandro helped her back to her house, where she insisted she was fine, though her injuries spoke otherwise. As he left, his mind raced. Ramon had crossed another line, and Alejandro couldn't ignore it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone Ramon had terrorized. That night, Alejandro sat in his dimly lit home, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph he kept hidden in his trunk. The man he had once been was closer than ever, clawing his way to the surface. Ramon had made his move, and Alejandro knew it was time to make his own. The village was no longer just a quiet refuge. It was a battleground, and Alejandro, for better or worse, was ready to fight. The air was heavy with tension, a quiet unease settling over the village in the days following the attack on Maria. Alejandro noticed how people avoided the market, how mothers hurried their children inside at the faintest sound of Ramon's gang approaching. It was as if the village itself had drawn inward, holding its breath in anticipation of what would come next. In his small home, Alejandro worked with steady determination. The trunk in the corner was now empty, its contents spread across his table. Weapons, tools, maps of the village, each item was a piece of the puzzle he was assembling. He had spent days observing Ramon's movements, watching his gang grow more brazen in their attempts to reassert dominance. They were slipping, growing reckless in their desperation to regain control. Alejandro had no intention of waiting for their next move. He wheeled himself to a small makeshift workbench where he'd been fashioning traps from old tools and scrap metal. One was nearly complete, a tripwire mechanism designed to disable, not kill. He wasn't just planning a confrontation, he was preparing to dismantle Ramon's hold on the village piece by piece. Maria arrived in the late afternoon, her arms still bandaged but her spirit unbroken. She knocked once before stepping inside, her eyes immediately landing on the array of equipment spread across the room. "You're really going through with this," she said, more a statement than a question. Alejandro didn't look up. "I don't have a choice." Maria moved closer, her voice lowering. "You don't have to do this alone. There are people who want to help." He paused, his hands stilling over the tripwire. "They're scared, Maria. Ramon has made sure of that. And if they get involved, they'll be targets." "They already are," she argued. "You've seen it. They're just waiting for someone to show them it's possible to fight back." Her words lingered in the air as Alejandro resumed his work. He wanted to believe her, to trust that the villagers could stand together. But he had seen fear up close, and he knew how it could paralyze even the strongest among them. Still, Maria's determination sparked something in him. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "If they're willing to stand, I'll make sure they have a chance." Maria nodded, her expression softening. "Good, because Ramon won't see it coming." That evening, Alejandro ventured out under the cover of darkness, planting the traps he'd constructed in strategic locations around the village. He chose places Ramon and his gang frequented, ensuring they would encounter resistance at every turn. Each tripwire, each hidden obstacle was a step toward reclaiming the village. When he returned home, exhaustion settled over him, but it was accompanied by a sense of purpose. The groundwork was laid. The confrontation he had tried to avoid was now inevitable, and Alejandro was ready. Ramon might have thought he was untouchable, but Alejandro knew better. He had been forged in fire once, and now the embers of that fire burned brighter than ever. The moon hung high above the village, casting pale light over the cobblestone streets. The air was still, heavy with anticipation. Alejandro sat silently in the shadows near the village square, every muscle in his body taut. The traps had been set, the plans laid. Now it was only a matter of time. The distant sound of boots on stone shattered the quiet. Ramon and his gang were approaching, their laughter carrying an edge of cruelty. Alejandro's heart pounded as he wheeled himself into position. He had spent days planning for this moment, and every detail had to unfold perfectly. Ramon's gang entered the square like they owned it, their loud, mocking voices breaking the silence. There were 7 of them, including Ramon, their arrogance palpable as they surveyed the space. Alejandro watched from the shadows, his eyes sharp, his breath steady. "Looks like our little message got across," Ramon sneered, glancing around. "The rats are hiding." The gang laughed, but their amusement was short-lived. The first trap sprang to life as one of Ramon's men tripped a hidden wire. A small explosion of smoke erupted, disorienting the group. Shouts and curses followed as they stumbled back, coughing and covering their eyes. "What the hell was that?" one of them yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Alejandro took the moment of chaos to act. He rolled forward, his movement swift and silent, and tossed a small device toward the group. It clattered to the ground and released another burst of thick, choking smoke. The gang scattered, their cohesion breaking as they tried to regain their bearings. From the edge of the square, Alejandro's voice rang out, cold and steady. "You've pushed too far, Ramon." The gang froze, their eyes darting toward the sound. Ramon stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "You think you can scare me? Come out and face me like a man." Alejandro emerged from the shadows, his wheelchair gliding into the moonlight. His calm demeanor only enraged Ramon further. "Look at you," Ramon sneered. "A cripple playing games. You really think you can stop us?" "I don't need to stop you," Alejandro replied, his voice even. "I just need to show the village you're nothing but a bully hiding behind fear." Ramon lunged toward him, but Alejandro was ready. Another trap triggered, releasing a loud bang and a shower of sparks that sent Ramon stumbling back. The gang hesitated, their confidence eroding as Alejandro methodically picked them apart, one trap at a time. Each wire tripped, each smoke burst, was a reminder that they were no longer in control. One of Ramon's men, desperate to escape, ran toward an alley, but was caught by a tripwire that sent him sprawling. The villagers, who had been watching from the safety of their homes, began to emerge cautiously, emboldened by the gang's disarray. Alejandro saw their faces, their fear giving way to something stronger, hope. Ramon noticed it too, and his fury boiled over. He drew a knife, advancing on Alejandro with a snarl. "No more tricks," Ramon roared, charging forward. Alejandro didn't flinch. Instead, he wheeled himself backward, luring Ramon into the final trap. The ground beneath Ramon gave way as a hidden pit Alejandro had prepared swallowed him up to his waist. Ramon struggled, his knife falling from his hand as he flailed. The villagers erupted in murmurs, their shock quickly turning to cheers as they realized Ramon had been defeated. Alejandro approached the edge of the pit, looking down at the man who had terrorized them for so long. "It's over," Alejandro said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "Leave this village and never come back." Ramon's face twisted with rage, but he could see the writing on the wall. His gang was scattered, the villagers emboldened, and his hold on the village shattered. With a growl of frustration, he spat at Alejandro's feet but said nothing. Alejandro turned to the crowd. "This is your village," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You don't have to live in fear. Ramon only had power because you gave it to him. Take it back." The villagers, galvanized by his words and Ramon's defeat, began to surround the pit. Some carried ropes, others brandished tools, and their collective presence was enough to force the remaining gang members to surrender. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Ramon and his men were forced to leave the village under the watchful eyes of its people. Alejandro stayed behind, watching from the square as the villagers began to clean up the remnants of the confrontation. They had won, but the battle had cost them. Maria approached Alejandro, her face a mix of pride and concern. "You did it," she said softly. Alejandro nodded, exhaustion weighing on him. "No, we did it." For the first time in years, the village felt alive, not with fear, but with a renewed sense of unity. Alejandro knew the fight wasn't over. The scars Ramon had left would take time to heal. But for now, they had reclaimed their home. The village awoke to a new day, bathed in the golden light of a sun that seemed brighter than it had in years. The heavy weight of fear that had hung over its streets was finally lifting, replaced by cautious hope. Ramon and his gang were gone, and with them, the stranglehold they had on the villagers. Alejandro sat outside his home, watching as neighbors moved through the streets with an energy that had been absent for far too long. Children played near the market, their laughter echoing off the walls. Vendors reopened their stalls, their voices lively once more. The transformation was subtle, but it was undeniable. The village was beginning to heal. Maria arrived mid-morning, a determined look on her face and a notebook clutched tightly in her hands. "We need to talk," she said, not waiting for an invitation as she stepped inside Alejandro's home. He smiled faintly. "I thought I'd earned a break." "You've earned plenty, but this isn't over," she replied, pulling out a chair and sitting across from him. "The village is on the verge of something important. We need to rebuild, organize, make sure this doesn't happen again." Alejandro nodded slowly, listening as Maria laid out her plans. She wanted to form a council, a group of villagers who would work together to protect the community and address its needs. She spoke with conviction, her passion contagious. "I'll help however I can," Alejandro said finally. "But this is your fight now. The people trust you." Maria hesitated, then smiled. "They trust you too, Alejandro, more than you realize." Over the next few days, the village came together in a way Alejandro hadn't seen before. Neighbors who once kept to themselves worked side by side to repair broken fences and repaint weathered walls. The square, once a place of fear, became a hub of activity. Maria's council began to take shape, with Alejandro offering quiet guidance from the sidelines. One evening, as the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Alejandro found himself surrounded by villagers who approached to thank him. Their words were kind, their gratitude genuine, but he felt an odd mix of pride and discomfort. He hadn't sought to be a hero. He had simply done what needed to be done. As the village continued to rebuild, Alejandro realized that his role was changing. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He was part of something larger, a community rediscovering its strength. The days following the defeat of Ramon felt different. There was a shift in the village, an undeniable sense of renewal that had once seemed impossible. It wasn't just the absence of fear or the rebuilding of homes. It was the way the people carried themselves now. There was purpose in their steps, resolve in their voices. They had tasted what it was like to reclaim control, and they weren't going to give it up. Alejandro, however, couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in his chest. He had fought to protect the village, but as time passed, he found himself wondering if he truly belonged in this new world. The shadows of his past, once quiet and distant, seemed to creep closer each day. Maria's council meetings, the rebuilding projects, the collective strength of the villagers. It all felt good, but it didn't fill the emptiness that had returned to him in quiet moments. It was late afternoon when he saw him, a figure standing just outside the village boundary, watching. Alejandro's instincts, honed over years of survival, flared to life. He had seen that face before, though it was hard to place in the dimming light. The man was tall, with dark hair and an unsettling presence. He wasn't from the village. Alejandro wheeled himself down the path, his eyes locked on the stranger. As he got closer, the man turned, meeting his gaze with an unreadable expression. Alejandro's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. He didn't know this man, but something about him felt familiar. "Can I help you?" Alejandro asked, his voice calm but guarded. The man's lips curled into a slight smile. "I think you can, Alejandro." The name hit Alejandro like a punch to the gut. No one knew him here by that name, not unless they had come from his past, but he hadn't heard it spoken in years. He gripped the wheels of his chair, trying to steady himself, but the recognition was like a cold wave crashing over him. "Who are you?" Alejandro demanded, his voice sharper now. The man's smile deepened. "I'm someone who knows who you really are, who you used to be." A chill ran down Alejandro's spine as the man took a step forward. His posture was relaxed, but there was an air of danger about him. He wore dark clothing, practical, and his movements were precise. He was no stranger to violence. The same instinct that had once served Alejandro well flared to life again. This man was a threat, and his appearance wasn't a coincidence. "I don't know what you're talking about," Alejandro said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm just a man trying to live a peaceful life." The man shook his head, his smile fading into something more serious. "You think you can escape your past, Alejandro? You think it's gone just because you've tucked it away in a corner of this little village?" Alejandro's pulse quickened. "Leave now, or I'll make you." The man chuckled, not in amusement, but in a knowing way. "You really think that's enough to stop me? You don't know what's coming. You never did." Before Alejandro could respond, the man turned and began to walk back toward the edge of the village, his pace slow but deliberate. "You'll see," he called over his shoulder. "The past isn't done with you. It's never done." Alejandro sat in silence, his mind racing as the figure disappeared into the fading light. The words hung in the air, a haunting reminder of everything he had tried to leave behind. He had thought the battle was over. He had hoped foolishly that the village's victory over Ramon would be his own final redemption. But now, standing alone in the growing dusk, Alejandro realized that the past was far from finished with him. His history, the violence, the people he had wronged, it was all coming back. And the man who had stood at the village's edge wasn't the last shadow to fall on his life. The next morning, Alejandro went to Maria's house. She had been busy organizing the rebuilding efforts and had barely had time to rest, but he knew this was a conversation he needed to have. When she opened the door, her expression softened at the sight of him. "What is it?" she asked, noticing the tension in his posture. "Someone came to the village last night," Alejandro said, his voice low. "A man who knows me, from my past." Maria's face hardened. "Who?" "I don't know, but he said things that made it clear he knows who I used to be. He said the past isn't done with me." Maria studied him for a moment before stepping aside, motioning for him to come in. "Sit down." Alejandro wheeled himself into the small living room, his heart still racing. The conversation he feared was finally upon them. Maria sat across from him, her eyes serious. "This isn't over, is it?" she asked. "No," Alejandro replied, his voice barely a whisper. "It never was." The silence between them stretched, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Alejandro had built a life here. He had found a sense of purpose, a chance to heal. But the man who had appeared at the village's edge was a reminder that peace was a fragile thing. The world he had left behind was relentless, and it would come for him sooner or later. "What do we do now?" Maria asked quietly. Alejandro didn't know. He could feel the pull of his old life, the violent man who had once been unstoppable. But he wasn't that man anymore. The village had shown him a new way, a better way, but the shadow of the past still loomed large. "I don't know yet," he said, his voice thick with uncertainty. "But I won't let it take everything I've built here." Maria nodded. "Then we fight, Alejandro, together. This village is your home now. You have people here who will stand by you." Alejandro looked out the window, toward the village that had embraced him. And for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe the past would never truly leave him. But here, in this place, he had found a new chapter, and he would fight to protect it, no matter the cost. The story of Alejandro teaches us that no matter how far we run, the shadows of our past often find a way to catch up. But it also shows us the power of resilience, redemption, and standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. If you were in his position, would you have confronted the demons of your past or continued to seek peace in silence? What would you risk to protect the people you care about? Click the video on your screen to dive deeper into this journey of self-discovery and redemption. Join us as we uncover the choices that shape us and the strength it takes to rebuild a life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge your perspective and inspire your soul. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.